Football is no stranger to these two neighboring countries, Honduras and El Salvador. Stadiums are often packed when their national team competes. Although they have never won a prestigious trophy, both are doing quite well on the international stage. In terms of World Cup participation statistics, Honduras has the upper hand. Their national team has participated in 3 World Cup appearances: Spain 1982, South Africa 2010 and Brazil 2014. El Salvador, on the other hand, have participated in 2 World Cup tournaments, Mexico 1970 and Spain 1982. However, the struggle to reach the 1970 World Cup may be a lasting memory for both El Salvador and Honduras. In the 1970 World Cup qualifiers, Honduras and El Salvador had to face each other. The first match was held in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. High tension was presented off the pitch. The night before the match, TalkSport said the Honduran supporters as hosts played psychological warfare by surrounding the El Salvador players' hotel. They honked car horns, sang loudly, whistled, and screamed all night. The Honduran fans' efforts seemed to work. As they played at home under high pressure, Honduras won by 1 goal without return, thanks to Roberto Cardona's late goal. El Salvador's defeat was not well received by many supporters. An 18-year-old El Salvadoran girl, Amelia Bolanos, even committed suicide by shooting herself in the head. She instantly became an icon of nationalism to the Salvadoran public. Bolanos' funeral was broadcast on television. She was heralded as a warrior to the extent that the president of El Salvador, ministers, and national team players attended her funeral. Honduras, on the other hand, was under heavy pressure. It had to visit El Salvador for the second leg, which was held on 15th of June, 1969. Before the match, it was the turn of the Honduran national team to spend a sleepless night in the hotel where they were staying. El Salvador fans were screaming, breaking windows, throwing rotten eggs, rat carcasses, and so on. The Honduran national team set off for the stadium under heavy escort in armored cars, breaking through the barricades of Salvadoran supporters who lined the roadside holding photos of Bolanos. Before the match had even started, 3 people had already died in clashes. The army had surrounded the stadium, with several armed squads also inside. Amidst the overwhelming support and hot tension, El Salvador defeated Honduras by 3-0. The fans celebrated the victory by burning the Honduran flag, and the players and staff immediately ran for their lives. This defeat did not make Honduras disappointed, instead they were grateful.
"We are very lucky that we lost. Otherwise, we wouldn't be alive today,"
said Mario Griffin, the Honduras coach. But some Honduran fans were truly unlucky. 2 Hondurans were killed on the streets of Salvador, others were physically attacked, such as getting kicked and beaten. Dozens of Hondurans were rushed to the hospital. In the end, the country's borders were closed. At that time, the aggregate score system was not yet in use. So, the 2 teams had to play the final match once again to determine who had the right to play in the 1970 Mexico World Cup. Considering the high tension between the two, and upholding neutrality, the match was held in Mexico City, Mexico on the 26th of June. The Mexican police had to deploy 5,000 police personnel with full arms to secure the 2 supporters at the stadium. Around 5,000 El Salvador supporters flew 770 miles to Mexico City. Before that, all El Salvador players and their staff were summoned to the president's house to be strongly motivated that they were defending their homeland and national dignity. The match was exciting. El Salvador took a 2-goal lead. But Honduras tied the game and forced the match into additional time. El Salvador came with a spirit of nationalism and pride. Victory was a fixed price. El Salvador's coach, Argentine Gregorio Bundio, gave a deadly whisper by ordering his team to tackle the Honduran players in any way they saw fit. Honduras striker Enrique Cardona experienced the brutality of the Salvadoran players firsthand.
"I had my opponent's shoes up to my chest. I've played in Spain, England, Ireland, and I've never experienced anything like this before.
In the end, El Salvador managed to score one decisive goal through Mauricio Alonso Rodriguez. The match ended in favor of El Salvador, who scored 3 goals, while Honduras was only able to score 2 goals in return. The result led to newspapers from both countries throwing negative labels at each other, from Nazis, dwarves, drunks, sadists, aggressors, to thieves. 2 weeks after the match, a war in the truest sense of the word actually took place. On July 14, 1969, an airplane over Tegucigalpa dropped a bomb. Salvador officially invaded Honduras. It's fine to attribute the football chaos as a trigger for military war. But that is only part of what appears on the surface like an iceberg phenomenon. The roots of the dispute between the two neighboring countries are much more than just prestige on the field. The 1960s was a difficult time for countries in Central America, including Honduras and El Salvador. Economic privatization, land tenure, and overcrowding became a time bomb for workers and peasants. In El Salvador, land ownership was very limited and not proportional to the population density. El Salvador was then the most densely populated country in the Americas. This contrasted with Honduras, which has an area 5 times that of Salvador and a relatively small population. These conditions forced around 300,000 Salvadorans to invade Honduras to try their luck. By the end of the 1960s, the number of El Salvadoran farmers working on Honduran farms reached 20% of the total rural population. Meanwhile, in Honduras itself, the economy had been experiencing instability since the 1950s and tapered off in the late 1960s. Honduras became the least developed economy among other Central American countries. In 1967, Honduras' gross domestic product per capita was only $236, the lowest on the Central American continent. This condition led certain parties to link the economic chaos with the phenomenon of the arrival of El Salvadorans. This opinion developed into anti-Salvadorian sentiment, and there were even allegations of mistreatment of Salvadorans in Honduras. Some Honduran political leaders and other groups began calling for agrarian reform on the shoulders of General Oswaldo López Arellano, the president of Honduras. In 1968, the Honduran Agrarian Reform Law was implemented. Salvadoran settlers could no longer work the land in Honduras freely, and were even ordered to vacate the land. Consequently, thousands of Salvadorans were forced to return home. El Salvador at the time was also led by a military man, Fidel Sánchez Hernández. As allegations of mistreatment of the Salvadoran minority in Honduras intensified, General Fidel Sánchez Hernández, the country's leader, did little to prevent Salvadoran public outrage. It was this series of tensions that sparked chaos at Mexico's 1970 pre-World Cup qualifying matches. The two countries had to meet and carry their sentiments and disputes off the field. The national teams and supporters of each country complained of mistreatment when playing at the home ground. Even when the deciding match was played at a neutral venue in Mexico, the hostilities did not subside. Until finally war broke out on July 14, 1969, El Salvador attacked Honduras from the ground and air. The Organization of American States had to step in to mediate the conflict between El Salvador and Honduras by calling for a ceasefire. El Salvador had rejected the ceasefire. They wanted Honduras to take responsibility for the expulsion and persecution of Salvadorans and ensure the safety of Salvadorans remaining in Honduras. However, running out of fuel and stronger pressure from the Organization of American States eventually loosened Salvadoran aggressiveness. The war did not last long, only 100 hours or about 4 days. The war ended with only losses for both sides. Around 60,000 to 130,000 Salvadorans were forcibly expelled or fled Honduras. Some 2,000 mostly Honduran civilians were killed, while thousands more were displaced and made homeless. In the 1970 World Cup, El Salvador lost to the Soviet Union, Mexico, and Belgium in the first round, forcing them to leave Mexico early. Salvador's relations with Honduras continued to be strained for more than a decade, followed by a trade dispute. The war officially ended when the two signed a peace agreement on October 30, 1980. Even so, good relations were not immediately established. It was only in 2006 that the two presidents of each country agreed to reconcile by shaking hands over the border line of the two countries.